the London Bridge Sports Medicine Podcast.
Medical news, health, fitness.
With Dr. AJ Seth.
Hi there. Welcome to LBSM's Ask the Expert series. We put the important questions to our experts to give you the latest tips in health and fitness. Today we talk to Jenaed, a dietitian and expert in energy deficiency. We all know the body needs energy to exercise, but we can often get the balance wrong between intake and expenditure. We talk to Jenaed about the best ways of keeping our energy levels high during exercise and what could go wrong if we end up becoming energy deficient. If you feel like you're suffering with any of the signs or symptoms of low energy or have a problem eating or fueling with exercise, please do get in touch to see how we can help. Hope you enjoy listening. Hi Jenaed. Hi, welcome to Ask the Expert. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we're going to discuss a really interesting and very important topic that's kind of overlooked sometimes when we practice medicine or in various fields of healthcare. Jenaed, before we start, just tell us a bit about yourself and your background and what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So, of course, my name's Jenaed. I have a background in sports science with a bachelor's degree in sports science, and I went on to doing a medical science honours in nutrition and dietetics, in which I have now specialised in sports nutrition, as with a few other things, but I'm seeing a lot more athletes, that's for sure. So I'm practicing on a private capacity. So
today, we're talking about energy, aren't we? So yeah. Energy means lots of different things to different people, depending on who you ask. But specifically around exercise and our energy requirements for exercise. Tell us, what do we mean by energy and why do we need energy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think energy is one of those things that is often overlooked, and people often just correlate energy to, say, physical activity, but that's not always the case, right? Like, energy is needed for so many functions in the body. All our organs to survive need energy. For our heart to beat, we need energy. To metabolize food, we need energy. Our brain uses about 20% of the energy we consume. So just to think, we need really energy. So maintaining the body's essential functions is, of course, just one aspect of energy. Another one is, of course, enabling physical activity and movement. So often when we think of physical activity, we think going for a run, but that's not necessarily the case. Like, fidgeting, blinking, twitching our hand, for example, that's all a form of sort of, energy expenditure. So yes, it does, of course, refer to going for a run, but it's also, basic forms of movement per se. And then, of course, we need energy for growth and repair of tissue. So this is especially important in specific times of life for growth of new tissues. So energy is very multifaceted, and there's a lot of aspects to it. So it's very necessary.
Yeah, and exactly right. It's not just when we run or when we exercise. We need energy all the time to be alive, and to maintain our bodily functions requires energy. And I guess the next obvious question is, where do we get that energy? Where does that come from?
Yeah, so of course, to get energy for our bodies, we need to actually be consuming it through food. When we have three main macronutrients, which is our carbohydrates, our proteins, and our fats, and that ultimately gives our body energy when it's broken down. So carbs are broken down into glucose, protein to amino acids, and fats into fatty acids. And those respectively produce energy according to whatever intensity of exercise that you're performing. So we need to eat in order to have energy, as well for physical activity and to just maintain those basic physiological functions.
So food and liquid, or water, or
yeah. So I mean, our body is mainly made out of water. So water is, of course, a very important aspect to it. But plain water is not necessarily going to provide us with energy. We mainly need it through macronutrients, so the carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. But of course, being hydrated is very, very important as well.
And just another myth that's out there: people are out on the sunbed and they think, "Oh, I'm bathing in the sun. I'm being replenished. I'm being obviously great for vitamin D." But is that a source of energy from sunlight?
No, not necessarily. I mean, our body uses sunlight to convert vitamin D, into an active form that is needed for, micronutrient and essential functioning of cells, but not not energy per se, right? It's a very different form. So we definitely need energy through food. Just lying in the sun is not going to give us the energy we need to sort of survive. That's for sure.
So food's very important. Are there particular foods that have more or less energy?
Yep. So when we look at the 3 macronutrients, as I mentioned, we have our carbs, protein, and fat. So fat actually yields the most amount of energy per gram at 9 calories per gram, where proteins and carbs are actually at 4 calories per gram.
Oh, wow.
So fat has double the amount of energy, but that's not to say it's our body's preferred fuel source. When we're looking at like the continuum of food intake and what is your body's preferred fuel source, carbohydrates are actually number 1. So although carbohydrates yield less energy per gram, it is our body's preferred fuel source, especially at high intensity exercises. So the theory of doing training, a high intensity session fasted, is very much a myth and actually quite detrimental to energy levels.
Is it just easier to access the carbohydrates than it would be the fat? Why is it a preferred fuel source?
Yeah, so I mean, at high intensities, because carbohydrates are broken down into glucose is the fuel source that our body does prefer. Fatty acids and proteins have to go through a bit of more of a process to get to glucose, to change that to be utilized as energy. So it's just more effective and efficient.
You mentioned high intensity exercise and basic physiological functions like breathing. How do we measure how much exercise we need or we expend how much energy we expend in exercise or in day-to-day life? Is there like a scoring system for that?
Yeah, well, the answer really is it depends in terms of measuring energy expenditure. It does depend on the resources you have. Like gold standard is what we would call doubly labeled water method, which of course is very inaccessible and really high cost.
Yeah.
In dietetics, in theory and in practical sense, we often use predictive equations that sort of takes into account your basal metabolic rate, so how much energy you expend at rest, and we add in on top of that things like your physical activity level. So this often ranges on, we score it through a scoring system from like 1.2 to about 1.9, which is called our PUL, a physical activity level. And the reality is most athletes these days do wear sports watches, and we know that this is not entirely 100% accurate, but with all the different forms and sources, we can come to sort of a median, right? An average in which we can see how much they do burn. But in practice, in dietetics, we do sort of use predictive equations to work that out.
Okay, so there is a science behind it, and there's also a side where you can get an idea of what energy you're expending from your Garmin or from your app or your Apple Watch by your heart rate or your number of steps, and to give you some idea of that. And I think most people will understand that doing a high intensity workout will probably require a bit more fuel and energy. You'd expend more energy than go for a slow walk. And it's important to be prepared for those different types of energy expenditure and get enough energy on board. But what happens if we don't have enough energy and we try to do these high intensity workouts, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So what happens when we don't have enough? It's actually it's quite detrimental to health in females and in males. And unfortunately, when there's an energy mismatch, is what we call it, when there's more energy going out than going in through food, our body goes into like a preservation mode, and of course there is this energy mismatch. We have impaired growth and development. We have often an increase in injuries such as stress fractures because there's obviously poor repair of tissues. Often females will skip their periods and skip menses, especially for 3 simultaneous occasions, or there will be a change in their menstrual cycle. And this is of course because our body's now prioritizing staying alive instead of the basic functions it should be doing, in terms of menstruation and so forth. Our immune system, of course, will get weakened because we don't have extra nutrients to keep it functioning adequately. Our bone health deteriorates. There's not enough calcium and vitamin D in our system due to decreased intake. And then, of course, from a training perspective, we have an inability to achieve maximum training adaptation. So the session almost becomes a bit pointless in a way because you train for adaptation, right, to see changes, and this doesn't occur.
And you mentioned quite a few. You mentioned quite a few symptoms there. It affects a wide array of physiological function. Are there any particular people who are at risk from being energy deficient
Yeah.
in your practice?
Yeah, absolutely. So we see it quite often. When energy requirements increase generally, and especially at specific phases of life, that's when we need to be even more aware. So the first one is those with eating disorders. So especially anorexia nervosa, restrictive eating, perhaps an obsession with food, what we call orthorexia. These individuals typically tend to limit food already as it is. So it does put them at higher risk for this. And over-exercising is often a symptom of that presentation. Another one is the elderly, due to lack of intake, often difficulty swallowing, taste alterations, and they generally have a little bit of a decreased intake of food. During times of illness, our requirements do increase as well. During times of recovery and injury, actually, this is super, super important, because athletes often think when they're injured, what's the first thing they do? They actually decrease their intake. This isn't great, because with a decrease in food intake, there's a lack of recovery. So it's quite a myth. We want to be maintaining the intake of food over there, especially due to injury, and making sure we're meeting all our nutrient requirements. And then, of course, in pregnant and lactating women, requirements are typically a little bit higher. So there are specific populations at risk of being energy deficient, and those populations we need to keep an eye out to make sure that they are eating enough, especially when they are exercising a lot.
So yes, you're right. It's specific populations, but also specific times of life, isn't it? Where actually it might not be obvious, and I think that's the thing here. That I think from the caseload of patients I see with injuries who are energy deficient, and also probably the caseload of people you see, there's not an awareness that they're not eating enough to fuel what they need, what they're trying to achieve, whether it's exercise or whether it's another physical endeavor. So I guess the question is, how can we make sure we're getting enough energy? And you mentioned some of the signs and symptoms that might suggest when we're not having enough energy, but how do we make sure we never get there and we always fuel it properly?
Yeah, absolutely. Just on that point that you mentioned previously, in terms of my caseload as well, I find that a big risk group that I actually didn't mention is adolescent females, especially those that are training. It's sort of a strange age where, you don't want to be putting on too much weight. You want to be trying to fit into the societal norms. So it is just an add-on to that, adolescent females as well can be a risk group. And how to make sure we're getting enough energy. So this is a tricky one, because of course it depends on your age, your weight, your height, a whole bunch of different factors. But just generally, what I would recommend is, so typically our hunger cycle, so long as, of course, you're not suffering from something like an eating disorder or where your hunger cycle cues could be off, but it typically runs on every 3 hours, 2 to 4 hours, let's say on average. We don't want to be skipping meals, and we really want to make sure that we are including snacks at least 2 snacks mid-morning and say mid-afternoon, especially if you are extremely active, because it is very hard to sometimes meet those requirements when you are expending so much energy, and sometimes 3 meals a day is just unfortunately not enough. We want to make sure we're having balanced meals, so not just having a big plate of veggies. That's not going to do much for our energy sources. Now that's great for micronutrients and it's definitely necessary, but we need our carbohydrates, protein and fats. I think there's a lot of fear around carbohydrates, but they are totally necessary in energy and performance, especially in the athletic population. And what I would suggest as well is what we call the plate model. So what the plate model refers to is different proportions of the different macronutrients on your plate. And when we're partaking in, say, moderate intensity exercise, we really want to make sure that at least 1/3 of your plate is your carbohydrates. So things like pastas, rices, quinoa, bread, legumes, for example. 1/3 of your plate is that. 1/3 of your plate is your protein. And then you have some veggies on there too. And of course, a little bit of added fat. Because fat is quite energy dense, we don't need to pile it on, but it is necessary, especially in female hormone production. So we do want to make sure you're getting your avocados, your oils, your nuts and seeds, for example. But 1/3 veg is often a good rule to go off. But of course, if your exercise increases to twice a day, that may need to mean that your plate actually has you have half a plate of carbohydrates. So that depends on that. The other thing is, if you are performing exercise for longer than 45 minutes and it's high intensity exercise, so this is more specific to the athletic population, or if you're an avid exerciser, you want to make sure that you're having a pre-training snack and a quick release carbohydrate. So something like a fruit is great, or some fruit juice that's going to give you a quick supply of energy and glucose. During your session, sipping on something like carbohydrate solution drink, a powdered carbohydrate drink with some electrolytes and some water. And then after your training, you want to be having carbs and protein. So chocolate milk is always a favorite with a lot of my athletes, because it has a really great ratio of carbs to protein. You want about a ratio of 3 to 4 to 1. So three carbs to 1 protein. And then, of course, recognize when you're restricting and seek help if that's the case. It's so important that isn't underlooked.
And that's a good point. So a lot of people will be listening to this saying, you know what, I'm actually on a low carb diet and I've been told that's a good way of losing weight, either by a healthcare professional or by someone else. Does that mean I'm going to be energy deficient? Is that an association of being on a low carb diet or a keto diet always going to be associated with being energy deficient, do you think?
I don't think necessarily, if it's done correctly, but I do think your body will start to adapt and change according to what fuel source you are giving it. However, it just will not be functioning optimally. You could be, say, on a lower carb eating pattern, but still having, say, 2,000, 3,000 calories, right? And you're still getting enough energy per se. But it is important that, especially if you're someone that is doing high intensity exercise, being on a keto eating plan or a really low carb eating plan is not going to be advantageous for your performance gains anyway. So in my opinion, you really are shooting yourself in the foot when it comes to that. So it is important that you do consume at least your carbohydrates before, during, and after. And it's definitely not something I would recommend.
There are times in elite sport, people would have read online, where athletes are trying to cut weight, and there's a specific requirement in a phase of training to lose body fat mass, i.e. if you're a boxer, i.e. if you're trying to gain a weight category. So certain times then low carb diet under medical guidance and with a closely monitored team may be acceptable. But what we're saying and what you're saying is that actually for the vast majority of people who are trying to be fit and active, it's just not necessary.
Absolutely. It really depends on, as you said, the individual and their goals and what sport they do, etc. So especially in weight target sports, because carbohydrates store a bit more water than fat and protein, there's 3 grams of water per 1 gram of carb, where the others are much lower. Naturally, if you're trying to hit a weight target on a scale, what's the easiest thing to decrease? Well, it is carbohydrates. And boxers would tell you when they're trying to make a weight, it's not an easy thing to do. They will be feeling fatigued. They're not feeling extremely powerful in that phase until they have their weight on, and then they will have carbs after that, right? But for the vast majority, that is not the case. And it's not to say that they have to have tons and tons and tons of carbs, right? It's not to fear carbs at all, but at least, an amount in each meal, and especially like your higher fiber carbohydrates, it's really good for gut health. So it's benefiting your health all in all.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jenaed. That's a really good overview of energy, why we need it, what happens if we don't have enough. What would be your top tips, just in terms of dealing with energy and having at least a better understanding of your requirements and what you're putting into your body and what you're expending? What would be your top tips?
So my top tips would be to try and not skip meals where possible. Don't let work and life get in the way of actually eating nutritious meals. Include snacks where possible if you are expending a lot of energy. Focus on carbohydrates prior to your session and carbs and proteins after your sessions. Hydration, never forget to hydrate. We never want to be dehydrated. And don't be afraid of a rest day. I think this is a big tip. A lot of people are scared of rest days, and we need to start to listen to our bodies. And when our body's telling us to rest, we actually need to rest. Don't overtrain and don't push through that, because it's only at detriment of your own body. And if you're unsure, of course, reach out to a professional, and don't be afraid to ask for help, especially if you find that you are restricting due to perhaps maybe an eating disorder or that unhealthy relationship with food, where you actually may need a little bit extra guidance.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Jenaed. That's been really informative. We're definitely going to have you back to discuss some of the other topics we mentioned there. But for now, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to LBSM's Ask the Expert series. We really hope you enjoyed listening. If any of the topics discussed are relevant to you or you want to find out more, please get in touch by phone, email, social media, or visit our website. Thanks again and see you soon.